bad bills that were stopped. So in your opinion, what are some things this legislative session that came across your desk or came, to the floor that, in your opinion, was a bad bill that you guys were able to successfully stop?
Yeah, and so the first one, and because it's the most recent one that we were dealing with, was Senate Bill 452. Now, this was what they called the END Act, Ensuring Necessary Deportation, and it was requiring that local law enforcement aid ICE agents, right, in detaining people and then handing them over to the ICE agents for deportation. And there are a number of concerns with that bill, everything from what's going to happen to our agricultural farm communities. And there were many representatives and senators from South Georgia who were very against this because of that. But also they added in some language that dealt with bail bonds. And some people, we talked about the criminal reform bill, and some people were like, wait a minute, we just passed this. Now you're going to take some of that away with this little language that's in this one bill. And so it wasn't a very popular bill, and we were able...
It went through a lot of changes, too.
It went through a lot of changes. It went back and forth. So, for example, we had language that went from shall to may, and may to shall.
Now, I would consider myself a regular person who doesn't understand, or prior to the legislative session, didn't understand all the technicalities in the meaning of words, right? So when you say shall and may, right? So for those of us who don't really think about the wording of legislative bills, what's the difference between shall and may if you are local law enforcement?
Yeah, so the idea is that they have a legal meaning. And so shall, under the law, means you're required to do it. May, under the law set, means that it's at your discretion. Okay, so that made a big difference as we were fighting on this bill. And I'll tell you, it went up to 11:45 on sine die, and we were still holding our breath to see if that was coming in. I was prepared, as well as other of my colleagues prepared, to go up to the well and to state our opposition to it. But we were very fortunate that, what was happening behind the scenes helped stop that bill from even getting to the floor.
Now, I know that some of the advocates for this bill were claiming that it is targeting undocumented immigrants who had committed a crime, and so therefore, why should we protect them? But I also know that those that were opposed to the bill had a rather lengthy list of reasons why this was a bad bill. So part of that, I want to go back to the bail bond issue. Mm-hmm. So for instance, Atlanta just passed some bail reform, right?
Right.
Okay, and so what would this bail bond amendment that was added to this bill, what would it do to places like Atlanta?
Well, one of the problematic clauses that this bill had was this idea that they could preempt local ordinances. Okay, which means that ordinance that Atlanta just passed about the bail bonds would be gone.
And so if Athens wanted to, like if this bill had passed, mm-hmm. if Athens wanted to work on reforming its bail bond system, this bill would basically prevent that.
Yeah, not only prevent that, but it sets up the dangerous precedent that then any local ordinance can be preempted by the state law.
Okay. So regardless of where you sit on immigration, this made it a really bad bill.
Yes, because it extended it beyond just the immigrant population.
And if we do talk about how it affected immigrants, besides the devastation that it has on families, it also was an unfunded mandate, correct?
It was. And that was one of the other things that we brought up in arguing against this bill is that, local enforcement is responsible for clothing, for feeding, for holding the people that they detain. And they would not get reimbursed for those expenses. So if you're holding a person for 24 hours or you're holding a person for 14 days, that's a big difference in your expenditures. And our local law enforcement was not going to see that money back. And
so while there was one adoption bill passed, what was behind this anti-LGBTQ bill? I believe it was SB 375.
So this was, remember when I said last session, the Senate added some RFRA language. this was the RIFA language. This was Senate Bill 375. And this was a deal that was made. If they would let the adoption bill be clean, they can put this as a separate standalone bill. And what this bill basically said was that a religious adoption agency can follow their religious beliefs, which was basically legalizing discrimination against the LGBTQ community and same-sex couples who would want to adopt. And I'm very happy to say this did not go through.
It did not go through.
It did not go through.
Okay.
And I think, there were many in the House that were ready to fight that across the aisle. That was a bipartisan in the House, not something that we liked at all.
Okay, so I'd like to finish with bills that were stopped by asking you about HB 403. What is this voting bill?
Okay, so, and the reason why I put this in stopped, and then later on you're going to see it again in what I say bills that's unfinished business, is that when 403 originally came out, it had some vague language as to whether we were going to get paper ballots or not. Okay. It gave sort of an alternative, an option between two ways. But it also had some language there as to who would make the decision. And the first rendition of this bill said the current Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, would make that decision, even though he's running for governor. So he would, if he was to do that, he would not be the Secretary of State who had to implement it. And so for us, that was like something, no, we want to make sure that whoever chooses these machines would also be accountable with their implementation. The other thing was that
seems like a good idea.
Yeah, so that they don't go away and say, oh, it was the other guy's fault, right? But the other thing was that this bill was supposed to be a bipartisan bill, the same way that we had done it years prior when we had gotten those new machines at one time. They were new, and it was put together by a bipartisan 50-50 Democrat-Republican committee that came together. And that's what was supposed to happen with Bill 403. That did not happen. The Democrats did not get the bill until the very end, and no public input was allowed in this bill. And that was the other big thing that we opposed it for. It was that the public, who they are the ones who are so concerned about our voting machines, had no opportunity, none, to go and talk about what their concerns were. And so what happened with this bill was that it ended up on its final version, right? The final version ended up being that it would be a study committee. Okay. To look at the bills. Unfortunately, it is not a bipartisan study committee. We were trying to get 50-50, of the both parties to be in this. Right now, the minority party only has one person that they can elect to that study committee. Let's
talk about some bills that you fought against, okay? So I'd like to start with this savings account legislation. So I think the idea behind it is, or what it is said to be, is a individual person can put some of their own money into a savings account and they can apply it towards a private school. But ultimately, what was this bill about? And I believe it was HB 664.
Yeah, so our concern with this bill, not that we want to tell people how much you want to save, but it was a very special type of savings account, an education savings account. So it's not like they were saving for anything else. But this idea is that then it moves money from the public to private institutions. And so not necessarily what most people would think of as a voucher system per se, but it would then in fact affect how much money goes into our public system, because all this money is being pulled out for the private schools.
I think it really helps if maybe people think about it this way, right? So my understanding of it is that this is just like a savings, like if you had a health savings account, right? So your money goes in there pre-tax, right? So you get paid, some of your money goes into there pre-tax. But what that does is by moving it into these accounts pre-tax, it lowers how much the state collects. And we all know that our public schools are funded by our local communities and taxes. So this would have, in effect, lower the tax base, right? Lower the amount of money.
It's lowering the revenue. It's lowering the tax revenue. And so the less tax revenue, the less money there is for our public schools. It did pass, though, unfortunately, but we fought hard against it.
What about the? So it seems like there was a couple charter school, private school, voucher type bills. What's another one that you fought against?
So the next one was HB 737, and this was a pure voucher bill for charter schools. I am not, when they talk about, education, I'm not the pro-choice type of person. I've always wanted to make sure that we were funding our public schools and making sure that that was the priority. And this HB 787 really permits the voucher and also makes the funding of charter schools equal to the funding of public schools. And people might say, but they're all our children. They all should get equal funding. But this is the deal. When charter schools were first brought into the Georgia legislature, they acknowledged that they were going to be funded less because they had other resources that were coming into them that public schools would not have access to. So even though they were getting less money from the state, it was being made up in other ways, like that savings account we just talked about.
Now,
okay?
a voucher doesn't cover all the cost of a private school,
No,
right? So just because they pass this voucher program, that doesn't mean that everyone can use it. If you don't make enough money to pay for a private school, the voucher doesn't really do you any good, right? So
yeah, and there are other things that are of concern, right? Because they want to say, well, even a public charter school any kid can go to. Well, not necessarily, because they don't offer meals. They don't offer transportation. I mean, it's a very hand-picked select group of students that get to go to these charter schools.
So this voucher bill that did pass is really only going to benefit a
small certain group of our population.
I know that there was a lot of controversy over this Stockbridge bill. Can you kind of tell us what happened there?
Senate Bill 263, and this was to de-annex a certain amount of land from Stockbridge proper and create Eagles Landing, the city of Eagles Landing.
So they were going to basically make a new city out of an existing area.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the problem with that?
Well, let me give you some of the background.
Okay.
Stockbridge had just voted in and elected their first African-American mayor.
So Stockbridge, Georgia, gets their first African-American mayor, and then this bill pops up.
And the other thing about this bill is we have to look at the property that they actually wanted to annex. They wanted to annex the commercial area, all of downtown. They wanted to annex the high-priced realty residential areas. They were taking away the value, right, of Stockbridge to create this other city without any of the debt that Stockbridge had. So when we talk about bonds, the bonds were going to stay in Stockbridge, but the revenue generation portion of Stockbridge all of a sudden was going to be de-annexed.
So this was passed, right?
This was passed.
So they created a new city.
Well, they haven't. What they've done is they've created the opportunity of a referendum for those people to come and vote to see if they do want to set up Stockbridge. The problem with the referendum is that it is only asking the people who want to create Eagles Landing. It is not asking everybody in Stockbridge, including those people who would lose that revenue base. So
they don't get a say in this?
They don't get a say in this.
Okay. What about this computer hacking bill?
Yeah, so SB 315, Representative Jonathan Wallace very eloquently spoke against it in the well during our last week of session. This is what they call the computer hacking bill. It makes it a crime just to break into a computer system, whether they say intentionally or knowingly breaking into that system when you know you don't have authority to do so. And so our concern was that's pretty broad. And what is that going to do to white hat hackers, people who go and look for vulnerabilities in computer systems to make them actually safer? And we heard a lot of testimony from these professionals and people in universities saying, this might actually be dangerous because it's going to be a disincentive for computer security professionals to want to do any of what they're doing here in Georgia.
Okay. I know that one bill that you were really passionate about because it falls under your expertise is this whole fingerprint bill. So what was that?
Yes. SB 336. And it actually started off as a House bill that we were able to defeat twice on crossover night. But this was a bill that said that for state agencies, if you had to get your fingerprint done to apply for the job, they would, for the first time, be allowed to collect it, to store it, and to give it to the FBI. And my argument was, let's not give the fingerprint, give the fingerprint minutia. And minutia are just the identifying markers. It's not the whole fingerprint image.
Okay, so I've got to stop you there because I've got a phone that requires my fingerprint.
Yes.
My laptop, requires fingerprint. So I think people use their fingerprints all the time. What are we missing here? What's the difference between a fingerprint and the minutia? How does that work?
So how these systems work is actually when you put your finger on it, it takes the image of the fingerprint, and every fingerprint's unique. It has certain curves.
Yeah.
And so it converts the image of the full fingerprint to just what is unique in it and takes out the underlying fingerprint image.
Where the curves stop or where they split, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So they don't store the actual fingerprint image, which is what can be used to open up your phone, your car sometimes, your houses sometimes. And so my argument was it's a very dangerous data point to keep if you are touching.
Have you ever seen those the connect the dot games?
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
It looks just like that.
It looks just like the connect the dot game.
That is a perfect thing.
So
Yeah.
that's what has usually been kept. That's what's been kept up to now, right?
Right. That is standard security practice, to just keep the minutia, because if you leak, if those fingerprints get out, it's so dangerous because everybody can have access to so many things. So we defeated it twice on crossover. They brought it back under another bill, right, which I did not know that they can do that. But apparently it's very common. It's called zombie bills, resurrecting these kinds of bills. They brought it back, and I spoke against it in the will, but they still passed it.
And what this bill would now do is, instead of like those connect the dot images, it would keep the actual fingerprint with the curves and everything. And then it also allows Georgia to give it to the FBI,
Yeah, and so
without any limitations or
And
restrictions.
the problem with that is, for the first time, the FBI only keeps fingerprints of criminals, people convicted of crimes. For the first time now, the FBI is going to have a whole database,
Okay, so,
right, of innocent people's fingerprints.
So innocent people, we're talking anybody who gets a license, right? So like somebody who goes in to be a beautician needs to be
Well,
licensed.
actually, they restricted it now
they
to
did
only
restrict it.
4 agencies. So at first it was like 19, 20 agencies that they were going to do this to, including beauticians, as you said. They restricted that down to 4 agencies that dealt with the children or the elderly. Okay, but even there, why should someone who's innocent, who's never been convicted of a crime, now, because their fingerprints are in an FBI agency database, they can now be treated as a criminal?
So that's going to be, just as an example, tens of thousands of Georgians who work in the public school system, who are kindergarten teachers or music teachers, and the
Special
FBI
education teachers, yeah,
and the FBI is going to have access to their fingerprints now.
absolutely.
Okay, so what about this free speech bill?
So Senate Bill 339. This was supported by Representative Earl Earhart. You may have heard of him. He was one of the people,
He was pushing the HB
51 against sexual, the idea of the reporting requirement of sexual assault on campus. But this was a bill supposedly to protect free speech on campus, requiring universities to have free speech policies, which they actually do. And one of the problems with this bill was he sort of brought students to testify about it, but they were all of only one perspective. And, for many free speech attorneys like myself or the ACLU, this was dangerous because you were actually putting one perspective above the others.
Now, let me see if I can articulate this correctly. The proponents of the free speech bill, those arguing for it, were saying that across the country, universities had these speakers that they were bringing in, and that protest or that students speaking out, etc., were basically causing these speakers not to show up, right? And they're arguing that that's limiting free speech. You're not hearing perspectives, but people opposed to the Free Speech Act were arguing that their very right to protest is free speech.
Exactly. And, I encourage everybody to go listen to Earl Earhart's presentation, because he basically shouted down another representative, Representative Renita Shannon, when she said, freedom of speech guarantees that those protest students have every right to say what they're saying in protest, as the speaker does to say what they're going to say. And he came out erroneously saying that that is not true.
Wow.
Okay, and that he would dare her to sue him in any court of law about this. And so, even there, he was trying to restrict another representative's freedom of speech.
Right. So I think you hit on a couple important points. One, universities in Georgia already have free speech policies. They already have. So this wasn't really necessary. Two, it is a constitutional right for individuals, whether you're a student, right, on campus or not, but you have the constitutional right to protest and say that you don't agree with something or you don't like their views or whatever, and that this bill would basically get in the way of that.
Yeah, well, it also puts certain penalties like suspension or expulsion. I mean, for saying what you believe in. And I think that's really dangerous and the wrong message that we want to send out.
So if a university were to bring in somebody and a university student disagreed with that and voiced their opinion and protested, they could potentially be suspended or expelled.
Yep, they can.